Thank you, Connor, and thank you again to McKenna. One of the things I miss about in-person meetings, while also recognizing the benefits of webinars and the accessibility it creates, is that you don't get applause. Most people have black screens. I see Bob Shippey is the only one on the screen that I can see. He's waving the fist, which is nice. But I tell people all the time that I work with some of the smartest and most effective advocates that I've ever had in the entirety of my career. And I think McKenna and Connor just showcased why I say things like that. So thank you again for everyone who's here. We now see what's at stake, what the progress we've been able to accomplish together, the opportunity for growth to make Virginia a national leader in climate action. And, when you live in a state that is as purple as ours, things are constantly ebbing flowing. We can't always rely that one party's going to get power or the other. One election is going to go our way. We have to be the difference, because that's how we not just sustain progress, but also increase it. And so that's what essentially this is. What we're going to talk about next is a condensed version of something that I and some of the other staff members give to some more grassroots and civic oriented groups and different stakeholders that are interested in really having a influential and effective mark of the General Assembly session. So, Connor, I'm going to click this, act like was it. I have some animations, so if you just want to click through to get everything out. But we'll quickly go over this. This is just the Schoolhouse Rock version of what the Virginia General Assembly is. I always describe it as Virginia's Congress. It does everything the Congress does for the most part, but it's specific to Virginia. So the makeup of it is 100 House members, and I believe that these statistics might actually the demographic makeup might be altered given the last election, but that is I'm sorry, that should be that's an old number. Sorry, didn't look at this. I forgot to update the slide, but yes, we have a majority of Republicans in the House and a majority of Democrats in the Senate. Very slim margin in the Senate in terms of Democrats, it's only by one. So one member of the Democratic Party decides to break ranks with everyone else. That goes on to the lieutenant governor, who breaks ties, similar to the vice president and everything else. Again, Schoolhouse Rock version, powers of all the General Assembly members, same thing as in any Congress member. They can write and introduce bills, they vote on legislation of whether or not it should become law, and they serve on varying types of committees and decision-making bodies. So that's the quick version that you all probably know about. So let's just move on to the next slide. We need to talk about the need for advocacy and why it's important. And Connor may just jump in here at any time. But I think it's important for folks to realize the demographics of the General Assembly members. Now, it's not saying this because I'm making assumptions about them, but here's what we know. Behavioral science and study after study shows that lived experience can absolutely influence the priorities of leaders. We know that that's the case, and it makes sense. If you have a lived experience, you feel closer to connection to it, you'll be more passionate about it, you'll be more likely to want to fight for it in a position of power. So it's important to have a context about what that looks like in terms of what is the likely thing, or what is the likely topic that our leaders are going to be focused on, what's going to be on their radar. So quickly, going off of just the baseline demographics, we have a majority of men in the legislative session, although this is greatly increased over the last 4 years. It used to be like half the numbers in terms of this. When it comes to people who represent people of color with different racial backgrounds that are non-white, we have 29 out of 140 members total. That, again, is something that has greatly improved. And that is great because Virginia is a very diverse state. We're actually one of the most diverse states in the country. It is always a good thing to have a clash of perspectives. And when that's missing, we have harder times challenging the status quo that may be harmful. Let's look at occupations. Same kind of deal. This is very important to focus on. So business people, lawyers, what they categorize as public affairs or lobbyist professionals, they make up over 50% of all the General Assembly members. When it comes to direct service for public good, it's very much in the minority. When it comes to education, and we have struggling issues of education in Virginia. By the way, we rank worse in a lot of different metrics, not because of our teachers. I want to make that very clear, but because of the lack of support that they have been given on the state level. But we only have 8% of all of our legislators are educators. When it comes to medical professionals, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about pollution. When we have the actual direct impacts of what can be making us sick, that's an important perspective to have, but only 5% of our legislators are medical professionals. When it comes to nonprofit community workers, people who are actually in neighborhoods that may or may not be affected by particular issues, or like really working with the everyday people, the people who make up, the backbone of our state, only 6% of our General Assembly members have that occupation. And when it comes to transportation, as one of the most salient issues in the climate movement, we only have one member, which makes up 0.73%. That represents that occupation. And again, I want to underscore this, that it's not saying that these groups of people can't care about issues outside of their lived experience, or they can't learn about these things. It's just that what they'll naturally have a perspective of is influenced by their occupation, their demographic. We just know that that's going to be the case. So I'm certainly not trying to talk down about any of these groups of people. What I'm saying is that if you have a perspective that is different from these, that needs to be added on. If you have a perspective that is different from the majority of, from a representation that's not covered here, or is covered here but only in a very small minority, it will not necessarily be part of the discussion and the dialogue or the prioritization that goes on with the General Assembly and the direction of the General Assembly. So we can go to the next one. Go ahead and click it, Connor. I should have removed the animations for this, folks. That's on me. This is the other one. And again, I'm going to say very similar thing because I don't want to misconstrue what we're about to talk about. But at the end of the day, money in politics is something that happens. And it is something that I think needs to be surfaced because it can influence the perspective that we're talking about. It can, there's a group of folks of special interest who support my campaign, support my work, can help me get reelected. That doesn't mean you're always going to vote with those folks 100% of the time, or even all the time, but it does mean that they'll probably pick up the phone. It probably does mean that you've been exposed to their perspective prior to this. So that might be something that clashes with our goals, with our direction with the direction that we believe the state needs to go into. So if we're looking at the reality of that, over half of all the General Assembly members have accepted at least a third of all of their campaign contributions from private special interests. So that is part of our political system. It's certainly not unique to Virginia, but private special interest does not always overlap with public good or public interest. And that just needs to be acknowledged. And then when it comes to someone who, an organization, a monopoly utility, that is very much a thorn in our side with some of the legislation that they want to introduce, well, they are a top donor for both political parties. So this isn't about being a Democrat or Republican. This isn't about being conservative or liberal. This is about making sure that regardless of what party we represent, there has to be a perspective of advocates, of public advocates, that is present in the General Assembly. Because if it's not, then the things that we fight for, the things that everyone on this call believes in, may not be present in the moments that are key to decision making. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is just quickly the Schoolhouse Rock. It just kind of breaks down in more specifics what happens in the General Assembly lawmaking process. A General Assembly member has an idea for a law, and oftentimes the idea can come from them. It can come from an advocacy group like us. It can come from a lobbyist group, a contract lobbyist group. I should make that distinguishing. And then or it can be from a constituent, one of the people they represent. That actually happens quite often. They call that a bill by request. Then they send the bill to the Division of Legislative Services. The Division of Legislative Services drafts it into legal language so that it fits what's called the Virginia Code. That's just another way of saying Virginia laws language. And then the legislator becomes the chief patron. They're the people who can play the most crucial role in terms of the inside baseball, passing the bill, making sure that the bill is understood. Committees is really, 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 really important when it comes to the General Assembly session. That's where a lot of the public action, so to speak, takes place. What the process is, once a bill is introduced in the House, the Speaker assigns it to a different committee based off a different topic. So if it's a climate bill, it could go to the agricultural committee or the commerce committee, which deals with energy and economic. It just plays into those things. The committee will look up that bill from the chair. The chair introduces the bill, will bring the bill up during a committee hearing that is public, that anyone can go to. Then they hear testimony. Testimony can come from experts, constituents, et cetera. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then they vote on the action, which is another thing. I don't want to go too far. Then, just quickly, you all probably know this, has to pass a majority in one of the chambers. 51 in the House, 21 in the Senate. And once they do that, before something called crossover, it goes to the other side. And then we have to start the committee process and the advocacy process all over again. Then the governor signs the bill after that. In Virginia, we are unique because we do line item vetoes, which just means the governor can be like, I don't like this part, I'm going to take it out. That's not the case for a lot of states. Also, when it comes to budgetary stuff, the governor can cross something out and be like, I want this instead. And that just happens in Virginia, or they can just fully veto it. Vetoes, though, are reviewed in April and have to get approval from the General Assembly, whether it's a line item veto or an outright one. And if the governor does sign it, though, laws go into effect in July 1 of that same year, unless it's something written in the bill that says, this needs to go into case earlier than that or later. So that is the quick overview. So how can we be a part of the process? Well, number one, there's lobbying. And lobbying is not something that is relegated to advocacy professionals like myself and my other colleagues. If you are a constituent of your representative, then you are entitled to having an audience with them. And if they seem like they're too busy, or if you're worried you're too busy or you're intimidated by their status, don't be, because that's what they signed up for. That is what they're supposed to be. If you're going to be a public servant, that means you have to be accountable to the people you represent. And it's pretty easy to schedule a lobby meeting. Although if you wait to the General Assembly session, their schedules might be booked up. But all you have to do is contact them and ask for one. Even if it's a phone call or an email exchange, it's very simple to set up one. And then once you have an audience with the elected official, I should say that it's not necessarily going to be the General Assembly member. It might be the legislative assistant or chief of staff, which is perfectly fine. And sometimes that's actually an advantage because the LAs and the chiefs of staff are the ones who make sure that the train keeps running. They have to do an awful lot of research and make sure that they're giving insight and advice to the people that they work for all the time. Connor was a legislative assistant and probably can speak to that. I believe Connor, even though he's in a black void, is giving a thumbs up right now. The things to do in a lobby meeting is the biggest things to remember is you want to leave an impression. It's not about having all the facts and figures, although that type of evidence is important. But it's making sure that when you leave that meeting, that person you're speaking to is going to remember it. They're going to remember having that discussion with you. And the way you do that is, number one, explaining why you care about an issue. It's not enough to just be like, hey, this is a one-pager, that's filled with some data on this. I'm asking you to support this bill. But if you say, I care about climate change because my children and grandchildren deserve a future that has as much possibility and as much potential as mine has, then you already set down and legitimize your sincerity around the issue. And that sticks out. Same thing about when you want to use your bona fides about what district you're in and talking about your ties to the community. That can really elevate the impression that you can make. We always want to bring a handout because they meet with dozens of people every single day. So if you have just something a little bit that says, here's why I feel about the way that issue, usually it's like, I care about the Clean Economy Act because of X, Y, and Z. That's always good for them to have reference because they have to think about thousands of bills or get exposed to thousands of bills every session. It's really important to have something that they can reference in the future. But I will tell you, and I've heard this from multiple different elected officials, I've seen it during my time when I've lobbied the General Assembly, that personal stories is one of the greatest arguments that you can rely on. It is one of the most persuasive tactics that we can rely on. Because again, it's one thing to say this will help 12% of people in this area, but it's another thing to say is my kid has asthma, and we live near a coal plant, and he just seems to be getting worse and worse, and I don't know what to do. I'm just afraid. And if we don't do something to hold fossil fuel accountable, it's not just gonna be my kid who's hurting. It's not just gonna be my loved one who suffers, it's going to be more of them. And no one should have to live like that. Now that would be, that's an example I just thought of right now, but that's something that they can remember, something where they can put a face to a certain extent, whether it's yours, the person you're talking about, to an issue. Some of the biggest challenges that people think are obstacles of preventing people from lobbying or lobbying effectively is viewing the General Assembly members as celebrities. We have this automatic idea that they must be something special, that they must be someone who, defied the odds to get where they are. At the end of the day, our General Assembly is part-time legislators. They work throughout the year, sure, but this is not their predominant job. They're not experts on the subject matter that they are going to be exposed to, even if they're on that committee. This is just a part-time gig for them, and that means that they're not always going. We can't think of them as like some special policy wonks. They're going to be expertise in any particular area. Although there are some very special people that are like that. Most of them are not. Most of them need us to be able to educate them and expose them to the right perspective. Now, the things that it's on the don't list, it's not worth fighting with people. It's not worth having a debate. Say why you're there, say why you care, say what your argument is. But if you get into a whole tussle about these things, that doesn't help the cause, because, people in power can be fragile beings just like the rest of us. Straying from the point, I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. You want to stay on message. You want to stay consistent. In comms, we always say, if you have 3 good messages in core one, stay on those. Don't try to go somewhere else, because then they might associate your support for something with a myriad of other ideas. And then the same thing, this comes back to the personal story, only bringing up facts and figures and studies. Connor and our legislative team and all the people who've helped us with this are so fantastic in making sure that they are equipped with the right evidence on the academic side. What we need supplemental assistance with is making these issues more human. And so if you're only bringing up facts and figures and studies, it's not as compelling. But being able to, again, think about why you're passionate about something, that's how we can have a fully formed and persuasive argument. All right, let's go to the next one, Connor. Great, thank you. Understanding committees. So committees are gatekeepers. That's how you should think about them. They decide whether or not a bill lives or dies or goes to the next phase of the process. These, in some ways, they're easier to advocate with. In some ways, they're harder. But they're designed by topic. So the Education Committee, they will get bills that are related to education for the most part. They all have subcommittees. We'll say with the Education Committee, they'll have a higher education committee, and a pre-K education committee. That's kind of what it is. So a bill gets introduced committee. Sometimes it's like, we're going to send this out to a lower committee. They're going to discuss it and see whether or not we voted for it. An important distinction, if you're tracking legislation, which we'll talk about, is that House subcommittees can kill a bill. The Senate subcommittees can't. They can only recommend to kill a bill. So if your bill is going to a subcommittee in the House, you have to be a little bit more cognizant of the danger or risk that it's facing than if you were in the Senate. This is like parliamentary procedure. It's weird, but essentially the language that they use, if you're following these on a live stream, now that our committees are all live streamed, you can check them out, or if you're there in person. In order to have something happen with the bill, one member has to move and one member has to second. That just means one person says, I want to do this. And then one other person says, I agree. That's the whole thing. That's the magic words to make something happen, to create an action. Biggest thing, I've listed things out here. I'm not going to go them by one by one. But if we want your bill to succeed, the word you want to hear is report. If the committee votes to report, I move to report. I second moving to report. And then everyone vote, and then the majority votes to report, the bill moves on. Not report and refer, that just sends to a different committee, or refer, that's it. The only way that our bill moves on is if it reports. Let's go to the next one. All right. Similar to lobbying, it's about leaving an impression. If you're engaging a committee, there's some things you should be aware of. But the biggest thing I want to say to tell folks, which is a key piece of the advocacy training that we provide, is that anyone can speak at a committee. Anyone, doesn't matter how old you are, what you look like, how much money you make. If you can be there and present or on the live stream, you are allowed to speak at a committee. What will happen is they'll look at the bill, there'll be some discussion, and then the chair will say, is there anyone in the room who's in favor of this bill who would like to talk? Or if there's anyone on the live stream, if they're still doing that. And then once those folks have a chance to speak, they'll do the same thing, but for opposition. That's how it works. And this is one of the most crucial moments in advocacy, especially grassroots advocacy, because that's when they can see public support and hear from people directly. This is also important because the media is present. Well, they're not allowed to be on the floor and ask questions right there, but they can record. Actually, a lot of my job in the General Assembly is going to reporters during the committee and saying, hey, do you want me to talk about what just happened and how we feel about it? But what's also important from a grassroots advocacy side is that if someone tells a really compelling story, it could make the news the next day. I've seen this happen time and time again. I always tell the story about how there was this woman advocating for Medicaid expansion, and her son was in something called the Medicaid gap. Essentially, he was getting it, but he could if they changed the law. And she said, please vote for this bill because my son, he was born without the right valve of his heart, and he has to be on medicine that keeps him alive and keeps him able to work, but he can only work part-time. And the medicine that literally keeps him from dying is $500 a month and a twice yearly checkup that he needs to get to make sure that his body is functioning properly is $10,000 each time. And my husband and I, who are ready to retire, who've worked hard our whole lives, will bankrupt ourselves because what parent wouldn't do that for their kid? That story made the front page of the Richmond Times-Dispatch 12 hours later. So don't discount yourselves. There's an awful lot of people in suits with some fancy words and arguments, but if your story is powerful, that could be the one that's the most noticeable. When you testify to a committee, it's very important to just follow decorum that has been set prior to this, thanking them for their time, thanking the chair for letting you speak, saying where you're from. That always helps, especially if a member that represents you is on the committee, and then speak about the personal impact like my story just did. And you usually only get a few seconds, 30 minutes, 2 minutes if you're lucky. There's 30 seconds, excuse me, 2 minutes if you're lucky. So keep them brief, and then you just thank them again and leave. And that's what you can do, knowing that you got to be there and speak to people in power with your own words. That is the power of committees, and that's why we need people to show up when they can. And sometimes just having a bunch of people in line saying, I support this bill, please vote for this bill, one after one, that can also have a major impact. All right. We'll quickly go with tracking legislation, and that's it. So we're ahead of schedule, so great. So we'll hold back on this one. So tracking legislation is pretty easy. We have the legislative it's easy if you know the tricks. It's not the most user-friendly thing. So this is from the Legislative Information Services. This is where most of us rely on tracking legislation. It's not updated in real time, but it's the quickest one that's updated. So when there's activity with a bill that you may or may not be following, this is where we go. On their homepage, you can click Bills and Resolutions, which goes to this. You can look at all legislation. You can do it. You can look at it from particular members. So if there's a member that you really like and want to see what kind of priorities they have, you can click on there. There might be a member you really don't like and want to see what kind of BS they're trying to get away with this session. Same deal. You can look at it from there. You can look at what bills are in which committees at what time by clicking committee. And then, of course, there's by subject. I will say that LIS by subject is not the best. If you want to look up a bill by topic, then Virginia Public Access Project would probably be a little bit better in terms of typing in those search words, climate change, whatever, resiliency, that kind of thing. All right, so if you click on that, you can usually find your own bill. And this is a bill from last year, one of the myriad of bills that were an attack that Connor was talking about beforehand. This is essentially a repeal of the Clean Car Standards. You know, the thing that helps us get down, reduce our tailpipe pollution, which, by the way, is not just our worst source of climate pollution. It is also responsible for premature deaths of over 3,500 Virginians every single year. That's from the Virginia Coalition of Climate Action. This is about people's lives. This is about making sure that we're not just being acting on climate, but also making sure that we're making our communities healthier. This is, again, this is just an example of you can access it. But what's really important is if you want to see where things are going, this is history from last year. All of this is where you can see what happened. But history is also is not necessarily what happened in the past. It also tells us where the bill might be going. This is full from last year, but we saw that, as you can see from one item, referred to Committee on Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources. That's a link, and if you click on it, it'll take you to the page for that. You can look at the agenda. You can see when it's up. Then you see again that was signed to a subcommittee, and then this is the House, which is not as friendly to this legislation. They recommended reporting, which means passing the repeal of clean car standards. I will just take your attention to something that's really crucial and talks about the fragility of our progress. At the very bottom, you'll see that we defeated the repeal of clean car standards, a significant and salient aspect of climate action, by only one vote in a committee. One vote, that's all it took. And if you click on those, you can see who voted for it. Again, this is voting to repeal. Yeas and nays, just remember, like if it's committees, report is what you want. Everything else kills the bill. You can see who voted to report it, which means to pass on the repeal, and then who voted against that motion, that action. And so you can hold people accountable. You can actually look up their records and make sure that when you're speaking to them or speaking about why you don't approve of their record, that's where you can find that information. So that's just a quick view of tracking legislation. I don't know. I think that might be it. Connor, is that it? Dope. I am hearing the applause in my head. Thank you so much, everyone. Standing ovation. Wow.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I really appreciate you